Welcome to The Explainer. So today, we're diving deep into one of the most incredible historical parallels you will ever come across. Picture this. Everything you know about freedom, your entire political system, your constitutional rights, it's all collapsing right in front of you. But instead of grabbing a sword, you step up to a podium. Today, we're looking at two men separated by hundreds of years, Demosthenes in Greece and Cicero in Rome. These were guys whose absolute only weapon against massive military titans was the spoken word. It is a wild story about courage, some pretty brutal tragedy, and ultimately an unbelievable cultural triumph. Right off the bat, I want to share a quote that perfectly sets the stakes for us. The orator's natural enemy is the man with the army. I mean, just think about that for a second. On one side, you have armies, endless treasure, and absolute brutal military force. On the other side, you've got a single person armed with nothing but their voice, syntax, and logic. It's the ultimate David versus Goliath scenario. How on earth does a person with zero troops stop a literal tyrant? Here's our roadmap for today. First, words against tyranny. 2, two cities, one threat. 3, the making of an orator. 4, when words fail. And finally, an immortal legacy. We're going to trace the incredible shape of these two historical lives. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, Words Against Tyranny, the Power of Speech. You know, when we look back at history, we're usually obsessed with the conquerors and emperors, right? The guys with the armies. But what about the folks trying to save their entire world using literally nothing but their speeches? It's a crazy vulnerable position to be in. An orator is out there in the civic assembly or in the courts. If they want something done, they have to actually persuade their countrymen to do it. They can't just bark an order like a general and expect people to march. They have no other tool. Every single time a crisis hits, they got to stand up in front of a completely panicked, divided crowd and talk them into saving their own city. Structurally speaking, the orator is the ultimate critic of absolute power. Moving into Section 2, two cities, one threat. History repeating itself. So the ancient historian Plutarch was absolutely obsessed with pairing up Greek and Roman lives to show how history just repeats itself. And the symmetry here, it's wild. Look at Athens first. You've got Demosthenes spending his whole career ringing the alarm about Philip of Macedon, that's Alexander the Great's dad, by the way, who is trying to crush Greek political freedom. Demosthenes gives these fiery resistance speeches, which become known as the Philippics. Fast forward a few hundred years to Rome. A free republic is under threat again, this time by a huge military figure, Mark Antony. And what does Cicero do? He deliberately models his own resistance speeches after Demosthenes, and he literally calls them the Philippics. I mean, talk about an intentional, historical echo across the centuries. Which brings us to Section 3, the making of an orator, deliberate improvement. Now, you might be wondering, how do you actually become that legendary voice of resistance? Take Demosthenes. You'd think the greatest speaker in Greek history was just born with a silver tongue, right? No way. He had a terrible stutter. He was physically frail, weak-chested, but the guy just willed himself into becoming a legend through this incredibly punishing routine of self-improvement. He'd literally shove pebbles in his mouth and practice speaking just to force himself to articulate clearly. He would train his lungs by running up hills, sprinting uphill, while shouting speeches at the top of his lungs, practicing for hours in front of a mirror. It's honestly one of the most hardcore stories of self-improvement in all of history. And the styles that came out of all this, night and day. Demosthenes was all business, incredibly serious and austere. He treated the Macedonian threat with absolute deadly gravity. Cicero, on the other hand, was your classic showman, super witty, loved the spotlight. He'd previously exposed the Catiline conspiracy, and he just used this sharp, biting humor and sheer force of personality to completely win over the Roman crowds. But here's the thing, this wasn't just them picking a rhetorical style out of a hat. There's this concept Plutarch uses called synkresis. It's basically a literary method of comparing two lives to dig out these deep, fundamental truths about who they were. Plutarch really believed that how they spoke, Demosthenes' serious grit versus Cicero's flashy wit, was a direct reflection of their actual souls. Their external voices were just manifesting who they were on the inside. This takes us into Section 4, when words fail, the tragic reality. Because, eventually, the assembly adjourns, the talking stops, and the armies march. Despite their absolute brilliance, both of these guys ran headfirst into opponents who simply could not be talked out of being tyrants. Philip wanted Greece, and absolutely nothing Demosthenes said was going to change his mind. Mark Antony wanted unchecked power.
Cicero's gorgeous, biting philippics didn't persuade him to stand down. Honestly, they just made him furious. At the end of the day, syntax and logic just aren't enough to stop a guy with a standing army.
Which leads us to a pretty brutal conclusion. When words fail against swords, well, the orator usually dies.
Both men lost, catastrophically. Demosthenes was on the run from the Macedonians after the Battle of Tyranny ended Greek freedom, and he ended up taking poison in the Temple of Poseidon. It was a very sober, calculated end. Cicero's death, though, was way more visceral and frankly pathetic. He was fleeing toward the coast, trying to escape Antony's prescription, and they caught up to his litter on the road. He just stretched his neck out to the assassins right there. The military men won. The republics collapsed.
But that brings us to Section 5, an immortal legacy, cultural victory. Here's the crazy plot twist. If the story ended with them dying, we wouldn't be talking about them today. Out of these horrific physical defeats comes this absolute cultural triumph. Think about it. Philip and Antony's empires, long gone, dust. But the words, the speeches, they survived. Cicero's moral philosophy book, De Officiis, literally became a standard school book for over 1,000 years. Erasmus, the legendary thinker, taught himself Latin just by reading Cicero. Petrarch basically celebrated him as the patron saint of the humanist revival. Meanwhile, Renaissance humanists were scouring ancient Byzantine libraries just to rescue Demosthenes' speeches and bring them back to the West. Fast forward to the 18th century, and the American founders are looking straight at Cicero as their ultimate blueprint for a republican statesman. The entire humanist tradition is practically built on the shoulders of these two guys. Just look at this timeline because it really hits the nail on the head. In 322 BC and 43 BC, it is total crushing defeat. They lose everything. But zoom out to the 8th through 19th centuries, the Renaissance, right up to the 18th century framing of modern democracies. It is a sweeping, unparalleled victory. They completely failed to save their own specific republics, but they basically wrote the survival guide for every free society that came after them. So, I want to leave you with this to chew on. The tyrant with the army? Yeah. They almost always win the immediate battle. They take the city, they silence the speaker, but when the dust settles centuries later, who actually wins history?